March 7th, 1945. The fog hangs low over the Rhine, and from the West Bank ridgeline, a column of Americans stares through smoke and drizzle at something no one expected this late in the war. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen is still standing. A black truss of steel and rivets spans the gray water like a dare. Radios hiss. Voices overlap. A decision forms in the static. If this moment grips you, subscribe to What If. Wars for more untold turns like this. Down on the road, the lead elements from the 9th Armored Division push past houses with blown-out windows and laundry lines snapping in the wind. Men from the 27th Armored Infantry pile off half-tracks, hugging stone walls. The river smells like cold iron. The bridge's dark towers loom ahead, punctured by shell scars, the deck pitted with craters. Through binoculars, someone sees bundles lashed to girders, charges, fuses. The thing is wired to die. The command net tightens into a single point. A terse debate, seconds only. Wait for artillery, call in fighters, or take the gift before it's snatched away? The order comes across with the bluntness of a hammer. Cross now. Before the boots can hit steel, the bridge gives its own answer. A pulse of light flashes under the deck, followed by a flat, concussive thud that kicks dust from beams and slaps faces with hot wind. The span shudders. Rivets sing. A sheet of water leaps up and drops back in a hiss. Everyone flinches and then silence. The wrong kind, the kind where the outline remains. The bridge is wounded, but it lives. Panels are twisted. The decking is torn. Yet the trusses still grip the river's width like clenched fists. Move! The sergeants bark, and the first platoon surges. They sprint the deck in short bursts, each footfall a drumbeat on scarred steel. The bridge answers with a hollow resonance that vibrates through boot soles and into bones. Bullets stitch the towers. Chips of concrete snap like wasps. Smoke drifts from the failed blast, turning the air bitter. A young American platoon leader feels the world narrow to the rails on his left, the gray water on his right, the gap where boards blew out and a spray of nails lies glittering like frost. He does not look down through the slats. He keeps his eyes on the next beam, the next rivet, the next patch of deck. German guards on the far end pump rounds from smashed embrasures, tongues of muzzle flame licking at the wet air. A machine gun opens from the bank, harsh and steady. The Americans answer with short, angry bursts, muzzle flashes reflected in the river. Grenades arc and blossom along the east abutment. 2 men drop, and crawling becomes running again. A corporal skids to a stop beside a length of cable curled like a snake. He follows it with his eyes to a charge bag tied to a lower member, dark cloth wet with river mist. He clamps it, cuts it, yanks the guts free. Another man rips a primer like a rotten tooth and hurls it out through a torn rail. The package vanishes into the current with a heavy slap. Somewhere below, another team slides along a catwalk and beats at a smoldering fuse with a gloved hand, the heat searing through leather. The span trembles with each blast on either bank. Steel pops and ticks as if the bridge itself is catching its breath. Engineers, faces streaked with grime, shove across carrying kegs, jacks, wire cutters, coils of rope. One lays down fresh planks over a gap, 2 nails, 3 blows, and the deck answers with a deeper tone. Traffic control MPs take up positions with arms windmilling, already thinking about intervals and axle weights, even as rounds clap against the handrails and sparks spit upward in bright commas. On the east bank, a German engineer stands in a tunnel mouth and tastes the drift of smoke that shouldn't be there. He thinks of the list that said how many charges to place, what circuits to arm, the bad cable he had to reuse, the damp coils that wouldn't hold a twist, the powder that had seen too many winters. He hears the bridge still talking through the ground, that heavy hum of living metal, and he understands with the sick clarity of a craftsman that the blast was wrong. Too little in the wrong places, too late. The Americans punch past the last cluster of defenders at the far abutment and spill into foxholes already gouged into the riverbank mud. The first perimeter blooms like a bruise, rifle pits, a bar facing the tree line, a radio man panting as he hunches under a poncho. Behind them, the bridge keeps delivering men, packets of momentum, one after another. An officer from the engineers leans over the side of the deck and counts the visible charges still tied to bracing. He calls down to a team on the downstream catwalk. They drop to their knees, work knives like surgeons, and feed the river with the enemy's failed teeth. Another detonation rolls from the far bank, a ragged, grumbling thing that throws a wedge of dirt into the sky. Shrapnel pings from flanges and sails into the water. The rail rattles. The platoon leader feels it through his fingers. He tastes dust and oil and hears his own name shouted as a warning. A gap yawns 2 planks ahead, where the deck blew clear down to a glare of moving water. He steps wide, heel skidding on damp steel, heart hammering like a loose rivet. He doesn't fall. He doesn't even stop. He grabs the collar of a man behind him and drags him into the lee of a tower where the air is full of grit and whispers. The question creeps along the length of the structure and into every radio. Why didn't it fall? Why did that blast shake and scorch and twist, and yet leave the bones intact? The immediate answer is ugly and simple and smells like river water, aged fuses that sputtered, wiring that shorted in damp, brittle charges that never got the current they needed, and cuts in the wrong members while the strongest truss cord still bore the load. You can feel it in the way the steel still carries weight, in the way the deck, scarred and burning, continues to take footsteps. Back on the West Bank approach, engines cough to life. A scout car noses forward, driver hunched over the wheel, eyes fixed on the MP waving him across. The vehicle eases onto the span as if stepping onto the back of a sleeping animal. The bridge groans, then settles. Behind it, a half-track idles in line, the radiator ticking, the men inside staring out at the gray ribs of steel and the spray lifting off the river. The first vehicle inches, and then moves with a steady, impossible courage into the gap between towers, toward the far bank that a minute ago seemed like another country. Night folds down over Remagen like a wet cloak, and the bridge keeps breathing, metal ticking, deck boards creaking, the river talking under the span in a steady, indifferent rush. On the east bank, the first bridgehead is no longer a smear of foxholes, but a shape with its own pulse. Men dig the earth with dull, rhythmic swings, mud slapping their sleeves, rifles stacked where the darkness begins. Medics move, hunched and fast, sleeves rolled, voices low. The wind carries the bitter taste of smoke and cordite across a current that runs 4 to 5 knots, pushing at the piers with the weight of a moving wall. Engineers creep the deck with lanterns hooded in rags. They kneel and listen to the steel the way a mechanic listens to an engine, palms pressed to cool flanges, eyes on web plates where the blast bent a line that should run straight. In plain words, they work triage. Where the decking blew open, they lay fresh planks and drive nails until the hammer handles sing in their hands. Where a stringer split, they wedge jack posts and shore it with timber and scrap steel. They tighten bolts that tried to escape and wire shut cracks that want to spread. At the towers, they run their fingers over heat-scarred cords and whisper to each other about load paths and the way stress is walking through the bones tonight. The first anti-aircraft guns thump alive on both banks, 40mm teeth and 50 caliber rasp stitched into the dark. Their muzzles flicker against the black silhouette of the truss, and the sound stacks in the fog like a wall. Traffic control MPs plant themselves at the approaches with flashlights shielded by their hands, breathing in the fumes from idling engines. They bark the rules without looking up. One vehicle on the span at a time, 30 to 50 yards of spacing if they must follow, no sudden stops, 5 miles an hour. Steady as a heartbeat. Drivers nod hard enough to make their helmets wobble. No one argues with the bridge. Across the first 24 hours, the flow becomes something you can count in boot soles and exhaust. Roughly 2,500 to 4,000 men cross before the next dusk, along with a few hundred vehicles. Scout cars, jeeps, ambulances, and the first cautious half-tracks that make the steel hum. The numbers are estimates even as they're happening, because no one has time for a ledger when the deck is smoking, and the air is alive with the stray snap of ricochets. But you can feel the scale in your legs when the deck rises under a load and settles again. It feels like breath, and it never stops. The river adds its own rules. It swirls in slick eddies around the stone piers, pulls at anything loose, slaps debris against the upstream faces with a drumbeat that echoes through the truss. Somewhere below the deck, a rope dangles from a charge bag that didn't make it to the water. An engineer leans over the rail, grabs it once, misses, then takes it again with a gloved hand and hauls until his shoulder burns. The bag skates along the beam, trailing smoke like a wounded animal, and drops with a heavy splash that leaves a circle of white on black. On the east bank, a young platoon leader crawls from hole to hole, counting heads, touching shoulders, smelling wet wool and old oil. He hears the bridge through the ground like thunder that never quite breaks. Each time he lifts his face, he finds a different kind of light on the water. Flare wash, tracer arcs, the brief, clean white of a star shell. Then the dark slips back in as if it never left. He knows the worst thing is not the fire he can see, but the shell that comes low and blind from across the river. The one that arrives on a flat line and punches a square of deck out from under a truck. Near midnight, that almost happens. A shell slams into the western approach and jerks a section of planking up on one edge like a trap door. The scout car on the span freezes, engine sputtering, driver staring at a lip of wood that could catch the tire and twist it into the gap. Two engineers sprint, drop to their knees, and hammer the raised end flat with the backs of their tools while the vehicle idles inches away. The bridge gives a long, frustrated groan, then quiets as the wheel rolls past and the car clears the worst. A minute later, someone laughs, too loud, too sharp, and the sound cracks the tension just enough for breathing to become normal again. Smoke generators purr to life on the west bank, then the east, laying a low, milky curtain that hugs the water and slides under the ribs of steel. The curtain thickens and thins with the wind, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a blindfold. When it's right, attacking pilots will see only a smear where a target should be. When it's wrong, the men on the span feel along the handrail like blind men crossing a busy street. Still, they keep moving, boots to boards, boards to beams, beams to piers, because stopping is the only sure way to lose the bridge. The question returns in the quiet stretches between crack and thud. How can they keep this open when daylight brings the inevitable? The answer begins here, in the small hours. Survey boats push off downstream of the Ludendorff, with engineers crouched in the bows, poles probing the current, grease pencils marking where the river lets you work and where it doesn't. On the bank, another team lays out timbers and coils of cable, counting out distances under their breath. They speak of anchors and stringers and a span that floats because it must, a second path that will take some pain off the first. A captain draws lines in the mud with a stick and taps them twice, as if punctuating a plan that no one can see yet, but everyone can feel. By dawn, the AA crews have stamped their footprints into the frost and memorized the arcs they'll fire. The MPs have learned the faces of the drivers by helmet tilt and jawline. The engineers have found the deck's new song and made it steadier. The river is the same river, but the ground on the far bank is thicker with Americans, and their foxholes have edges now. Somewhere to the east, engines spool up in the gray. The sound comes thin at first, then gathers into a rising thread. Men lift their heads, spit, and settle into their places. The bridge waits with them, flexing minutely, alive, as the first day ends and the next wave comes on. Morning comes thin and metallic, and with it the first sharp stitch of engines high and fast. The river glints through the smoke like a scar. The towers stand black against a sky the color of wet slate. Men look up from sandbags and jack posts, eyes narrowed, counting the notes of the approaching swarm. The first attack run doesn't announce itself with a dive. It streaks flat and hard, a blur at the horizon that swells to a wasp-struck roar. Bombs hit water in tall, straight plumes, white at the bottom and dirty gray at the top, slapping the current until it buckles. The bridge shivers at the shoulders, then calms, and along both banks the anti-aircraft guns answer, short and savage, stitching dark threads into the morning. By noon, the rhythm is set. Approach, strike, vanish, then again. Some aircraft scream low, feeling for the span through the haze, their pilots dragging the sight across a target they can barely see. Others rush in at height and let go late, trusting speed to save them, and blasting past before the tracers can find a steady lead. But speed, the thing that keeps them alive, also steals aim. At 300, 400 miles an hour, the window is a breath. The bridge is a narrow rib of steel, not a rail yard or a depot, and the Rhine below is a mirror that lies about distance and angle. Smoke rollers lift and settle, and with every lift, the AA teams cut a new seam of fire through the picture. A wave breaks apart, one machine trailing smoke, another yanking up too hard, and losing its line. The river gets most of the bombs. Down on the deck, the engineers work by touch. They stop only when the steel around them whips with shrapnel, and even then they crouch more than they hide. A jack post bites. A stringer takes a bolt that should have snapped. Someone laughs once, short and surprised, then drives the nut anyway, grateful for this small defiance of physics. Traffic control holds the line, one vehicle at a time over the Ludendorff, slow and steady, while a second path is born just downstream. Rafts gather like puzzle pieces along the bank, pontoons bobbing in the chop, timbers stacked like ribs. Cables snake through hands and around winches, men heaving in unison. A sergeant calls cadence with a voice gone hoarse. Anchors drop with the thud of finality. The river shoves back and gets ignored. Night folds in early, but the attacks don't end. They change color. The wind falls, the smoke thickens, and the searchlights carve cold columns through it, their beams wobbling as if they are fishing for shapes. The tracers look slow at night, pretty even, curls of light you could almost pluck out of the air, until you remember how fast they travel when they find you. Somewhere upstream, a small motor turns over just once, then again. River water slaps softly against something that isn't stone. The first swimmer doesn't show as a man. He shows as a shadow that shouldn't be there, bumping a pier and pivoting in the current, then as a gloved hand on rough stone. The sentry's warning is 2 syllables and almost a whisper. Then a machine gun burps and a rope jerks up out of the water like a live thing. Charges tied to a float spin, snag, and break loose with a pop as tracers sting the surface. Searchlight beams spill across the downstream face of the pier, turn the spray into glitter. The river keeps its secrets, but not all of them. A second attempt melts into bubbles under the edge of the current and comes back up empty. Across the next days, March 8th through the 12th, the bridgehead swells like a lung filling. A believable count becomes a roll call that never stops. By the end of this stretch, roughly 10 to 15,000 more men have crossed, along with hundreds of vehicles, jeeps by the dozen, half-tracks in clanking lines, the first tanks nosing over, with a patience that looks like arrogance. The load sharing begins to matter. The new pontoon span opens with a grim little ceremony of 2 jeeps creeping over, and 1 MP holding his palm flat like a priest. The floating bridge dips and rises, finds its rhythm, and then it's open in earnest. The Ludendorff still carries the name, but the river now has 2 iron lungs. A young American platoon leader comes off the span and looks back once. He sees the smoke breathe and the tracers climb, and the way the bridge glows, faintly, with the friction of all those crossings. He tries not to think about the charges they didn't find, and the ones that were never built right. He thinks instead about spacing, counting off with his fingers in his pocket, and about the new path downstream where a tank can roll without making the old bones complain. In the same hour, a German engineer walks a rail bed 2 towns away. The message of failure folded like a blade in his chest. He had wired what he was told to wire with what he had, and the blast had talked back in the language of shortage and damp. Now, orders come down that feel like sentences. He imagines the truss members by their numbers and closes his eyes against the image. The Luftwaffe keeps coming. You can hear in the engines the strain of a war that has ground its teeth down, an odd pitch here, a cough there. When the fast aircraft arrive, they arrive as if flung, straight and clean, the war's late attempt at raw speed. But raw speed makes the sight picture a slit. Smoke cuts it thinner. The AA crews, who have spent days learning the geometry of this one sliver of sky, open up with a kind of grim music. The air turns into a net. One machine blurs low along the water, lifts, and lets go too late. The blast heaves a white wall beside the span and slaps the deck with a slap you can feel in your molars. Another tries to climb and loses a wingtip into the haze and is gone in a moving stain. By the 12th, the crossing no longer looks like a miracle. It looks like a system. Ferry points shove rafts toward the far bank in an unpretty ballet. The pontoon carries a load that would have bent 1 span to breaking. The Ludendorff bears only what it must. MPs now measure time in convoys rather than vehicles. Engineers talk about replacing planks after the rush, which is another way of saying they intend to own tomorrow. The river keeps its pace, but the men on both banks have changed its meaning. It is no longer a wall, it's a road with water in it. The question repeats, sharper now. Will the next high-speed run finally thread the needle, drop a single bomb where it counts, and end this crossing in a moment. The answer comes mid-afternoon, in a sequence that feels like it's been rehearsed by exhaustion itself. The warning turns into the engine note. The engine note turns into a streak. The streak turns into a line of falling shapes that vanish into the smoke. The AA hammers. The smoke lifts just enough to show the bombs stepping into the current. 1, 2, 3, each throwing up a fountain that drenches the truss but leaves it whole. The wave breaks apart in tracers and static. Men exhale without meaning to. The bridge shakes itself once, like a dog shedding river water, and waits for the next thing the day will bring. By March 13th, the river no longer holds a single passage. It holds a web. Downstream of the Black Ribs at Remagen, the first pontoon has settled into its cadence, and a second line is taking shape. Sections bolted, cables taut, anchors biting the riverbed with a patience that outlasts any single blast. Ferries nose back and forth like stubborn beetles, their decks slick with spray, their crews talking to the water with ropes and poles and curses that turn into grins when a load docks clean. The Ludendorff still stands, scabbed and humming, but now it's a member of a family, not a lone survivor. The sound changes with the network, not a single iron song, but a choir of wood and steel, an engine and human breath. On the map in a headquarters tent, the geometry is simple enough to make you forget the mud. Arrows cross the Rhine and spread like fingers curling into a fist. To the north, the Ruhr sits heavy and close, the heart of mills and coking plants and machine works that have fed too many weapons for too long. The bridgehead east of Remagen swells until ranges that felt daring 2 days ago are just numbers on a grease pencil line. Traffic control posts push forward out of the river fog and into fields furrowed by tracks. Supply dumps bloom in copses of trees. Artillery follows the flow and opens its throat from new ground. You can hear the change even if you never see a map, because the engines don't idle anymore. They commit. German headquarters reads the same picture and tastes ash. Orders snap down the chain, tight and hot, and bounce off shortages that defy paper. Fuel is a rumor. Airframes sit on airfields with tired mechanics and brave pilots who will get one good try at speed and aim, and then a wall of tracers. Rail lines that should carry reserves cough and stop. The word Remagen becomes a curse that attaches itself to officers who were there, to engineers whose math failed in wet stone tunnels, to commanders who did not plan for a bridge that refused to die. Discipline comes swift and public, the theater of blame meant to steady a hand that cannot stop shaking. It steadies nothing. The men who stand and hear the sentences understand the truth that everyone else can feel. The last wall has a doorway, and it is widening. From the river's edge, the pressure looks like weather that never clears. March 14th begins with frost that burns off fast and a sky low enough to scrape the towers. By noon, the sun pushes color back into the world, and you can watch a line of armor ripple over the pontoon like a spine flexing. The floating span dips under each track set and comes up again with the slow resilience of something that knows its job and keeps it simple. On the old bridge, the spacing rules remain sacrosanct. One at a time, measured yards, low gear, steady. When a tank finally noses onto the Ludendorff, it does so like a big animal testing ice. The truss flinches and then accepts it, and a cheer breaks somewhere. Not loud, not theatrical, just the sound men make when physics and courage pull in the same direction. To the east, shells answer in flat, angry smacks. Lines of impact step across the far bank and slap at road junctions and culverts, and any shape that looks like command. Long-range guns hunt the spans again and again, finding splash and shock, sometimes a scored deck plank, sometimes a twisted brace, never the final cut. Each miss costs time and ammunition the defenders can't afford, and every hour the network thickens. By March 15th, ferry points multiply like anthills. Boatmen memorize the current's tricks and stop losing ropes to the water's teeth. Engineers stop explaining and start nodding because everyone now knows what each hand motion means. Company messes set up on the West Bank and send coffee across in cans blackened from 100 fires. Chaplains say prayers with their backs to the wind and their faces streak the same gray as the rest. In the air, the fight grows smaller and meaner. You can hear the Luftwaffe's strength in what it can't do. Sorties come in packets rather than swarms, single machines throwing themselves at a seam in the smoke, pairs wingtip to wingtip, rolling into a run that ends in spray and tracer flare. Speed is still speed. It saves lives and steals aim with the same ruthless equity. An engine's clean note turns ragged and south. A pilot's angle is off by a breath. A bomb walks itself down into water that punishes errors with indifference. When a fast attacker finally drops clean along the line of the pontoon, the span flexes but holds. The blast a hungry hand that can't quite close. On the black bridge, paint scalds and flakes. The steel complains in long, low notes. The lattice endures. Inside German command, the language hardens. Hold, destroy, punish, redeploy. The verbs stack up until they pound like a headache. The choice to concentrate precious aircraft and fuel at this one hot spot feels righteous on paper and wrong in the results. Each commitment to Remagen is a subtraction from somewhere else, and those subtractions begin to show in places that used to feel safe. Meanwhile, the river crossing becomes unromantic in the best way, a problem solved by repetition. By March 16th, the figures, whatever ledger they will finally live in, are the kind of ranges that make planners breathe easier and opponents stare out windows. Tens of thousands now east of the Rhine, vehicles by the high hundreds, ammunition and gas in flows that turn single wrecks and road craters into inconveniences rather than catastrophes. Men on the ground feel the psychology flip in their own bodies. Americans who stepped onto the span 2 days ago with their teeth clenched now move with the brisk competence of workdays that have a shape. Germans who fired the first clean bursts from their side now shoot in jolts, then look over their shoulders at a sky that offers little comfort and a ground that keeps filling with new enemies. Rumors travel in both directions, that officers have been relieved, that punishments have been handed down, that more jets are coming, that a special attack will settle the question. Each rumor hits and slides off the fact everyone can touch. The river is behind more Americans today than yesterday. And yet, in the midst of this momentum, the old fear lifts its head like something remembered from childhood and asks one more time, if the Ludendorff Bridge finally gives up, does the victory give up with it? The answer is not an argument, it's a picture. Look downriver at the second pontoon working like a lung. Look at the ferry points biting the current. Look at the road on the east bank, now rutted with tracks that will not be erased by a single failure. Look at the depots moved across, the guns that speak from new positions, the units sleeping on the wrong side of yesterday. The network is redundancy made visible. The crossing is no longer a line that a single cut can sever. It is a fabric. March 16th fades with the water, talking the same talk it did on the 7th, and yet everything is different. The spans gleam with sweat and oil. The air smells like hot steel and river mud. Somewhere a priest murmurs, and somewhere a mechanic laughs at a joke that would have been treason a week ago, that bridges like men can stagger and still do their duty. Engines idle with a confidence that would scare anyone listening from the other bank. The map doesn't show fear or relief, but you can hear both in the way radios sign off for the night. Steady, clipped, almost calm. The stage is set for what everyone feels is coming. Steel has limits, even when courage doesn't. The next day will bring the sound that gives those limits a voice. March 17th, 1945. The river runs cold and bright, and the bridge that has defied blasts, shells, and speed at last finds its limit. It begins as a tremor in the deck that men feel through their knees, a subtle sway they've learned to ignore. Then the steel answers with a sound that is not the usual music of work, a deep, groaning note that seems to come from the towers themselves. Rivets tick like hail. A truss cord gives a sharp metallic cry. The deck drops an inch, then another, and suddenly everyone on the span understands what the steel has been telling them all week. Too much load, too many shocks, too many days wrestled out of fate. Somewhere near midspan, an engineer looks up from a jack post and sees the geometry shift. The angles that make sense begin to argue with each other. He shouts without words and flings his arm toward the far bank. The MP at the approach is already waving men back, eyes wide, voice gone high and thin. The bridge exhales a long, tearing breath. The center panels buckle with a terrible grace, members scissoring, gusset plates tearing free like cloth. The towers bow toward each other as if in prayer, and the span folds into the river in a figure the human mind will replay forever. Steel hits water with a roar that lifts spray into the sky and throws a wet wind down both banks. Men who were on the deck are now in the river, boots filling, hands clawing for anything that floats. Cables snap with pistol-shot cracks, boards wheel past like coffins. Someone calls a name, and the name is lost in the white noise of falling iron. On both banks, the reflex is instant and disciplined. Ropes arc from hands that already know how to throw them. Boats shove out into a current that wants to refuse help. Medics run with their sleeves already rolled, faces set in the same careful lines they wear in aid stations and in church. A priest works along the bank with his coat open, saying nothing anyone can hear, touching a shoulder here, a brow there. The river gives some men back hard and fast. It keeps others. The count becomes an ache that sits behind the ribs and does not leave. The names are not read here, but they are felt in the set of a jaw and the quiet that follows a rescue that came one breath too late. Then the second reflex, the one that proves the week has done its work. Traffic simply bends. MPs pivot like hinges and point convoys downriver without theatrics. The pontoon span takes the load with a shudder and then a shrug. Ferry crews open their hands to the water and make the current an accomplice again. The air is the same air, full of smoke and the distant shout of engines. The ground is the same ground, now packed with the weight of men and machines that will not be going back. The crossing does not pause for long enough to become a story about interruption. It becomes a story about design, about a network that assumed the worst and kept its promises. On the east bank, the young platoon leader who first ran the Ludendorff turns toward the sound that has ended and finds only the river's bright skin and a churn of spray. He knows without being told that the span is gone. He feels it like a missing tooth. He also knows that his men are here, their foxholes now deep and dry, their routes forward marked, their radios busy with the practical grammar of the next hour. He looks down at the mud on his boots and then out toward the country that no longer has the Rhine between it and him. The war feels shorter in that one breath than it did yesterday. In a room miles away, a German engineer stands very straight while words of punishment are spoken in a voice that sounds exhausted even when it shouts. He does not look up. He sees in the black of his eyelids the lines of the truss and the way the blast on the 7th failed to cut the cords that mattered, the way days of strain turned clever repairs into a wager that could not pay forever. The officer reading his sentence wants a clean circle, a cause and an end that meet and make sense. But the truth is not a circle. It is a slope. The moment the first Americans crossed and stayed, the slope tilted toward this day, and it did not tilt back. By afternoon, the crossing is louder, if anything. More engines, more voices, more traffic discipline shouted over more noise. The ruin of steel in the water throws new eddies that rafts learn and use. The pontoon flexes and carries. Fresh spans farther down the bank hum to life, their cable lines singing in the wind like wires in winter. The week opens into a road, and that road points toward the Ruhr. Artillery moves up and speaks from ground that felt foreign 2 days ago. Supply trucks that once paused to admire the black ribs of the old bridge now roll past a line of smoke and get on with the day. When night comes, the river looks the way it did before any of this began, dark, wide, unreadable. But nothing is the same. The last wall was climbed in plain sight, and even its collapse cannot erase the bootprints on the far side. This is how turning points sound when they are real, not like speeches and banners, but like steady engines, measured footsteps, and a network that survives the loss of one proud piece. Grief holds its place beside relief, as it should. Somewhere a letter begins to form in a medic's head, and somewhere a mechanic drops onto a crate and rubs his eyes with hands that smell like hot oil in winter. The river keeps its indifferent counsel, and the war moves with new speed. In the weeks to come, reports will put ranges to the totals, men across by the tens of thousands, vehicles in the high hundreds and then beyond. But those lines won't capture the thing you can taste here, the feel of a city's breath on the far bank, the sense that a continent's roads have swung open, the knowledge that a door once thought permanent has been walked through and will not close again. Remagen will sit in memory as a miracle and a grind, a burst of luck hammered into permanence by hands that would not stop. And so, the story here ends where it always had to end, not with a single bridge standing forever, but with the fact that enough men crossed while it stood to make its fall irrelevant to the outcome. The Rhine is behind them now. The maps on both sides know it, and the silence inside some headquarters knows it best of all. This video's content is compiled from multiple sources. If anything is incorrect or needs clarification, please comment below. See you next time.